a joker.
Brilliant. Fast. A little bit mad.
Hey, what is up, guys? So, it's no surprise that when Hollywood finds a new cow to milk, they will, for all it's worth. And I've recently shared similar sentiments on one of my earlier videos on milking millennial nostalgia, and how the mainstream movie factory these days tends to just shamelessly churn out one nostalgic cash grab after the other, when literally no one asked. Yeah, I'm talking to you. But even more recently, in the past couple of years, we've seen a subsect of this bandwagon emerge, one painted with an edgier, hello, Hot Topic merch galore, coat of paint. Yes, I'm talking about the relatively new trend of villain origin stories. Cinematic adaptations of classic bad guys that not only grant us a deeper look into their personal histories and how they came to be, well, bad, but also surprisingly shines a more sympathetic or maybe even inspirational light on these famously evil yet beloved icons. So why is this Hollywood's new thing? Why are filmmakers suddenly becoming attorneys for characters well known to be cold-blooded, narcissistic, homicidal assholes? Just this year, the Disney conveyor belt gave us Craig Gillespie's Cruella, an almost heroic origin story for a villain famed for her desire to skin innocent Dalmatian puppies. Now, disclaimer, I actually found Cruella to be pretty fun. My expectations weren't even on the ground, but beneath it. And I was pleasantly surprised. I actually enjoyed the movie for what it was. And granted, and I'll get more into this later on in the video, the movie did make a few changes to the character so as to not have us literally root for a self-centered dog killer. But despite all this, it does make me wonder, how in the writer's room did someone even come up with the idea to make a badass #girlboss sympathetic backstory for a character literally named Cruella De Vil? Well, a simple answer to that would be Maleficent and the Joker made absolute f***ing bank. But diving even further, how did these characters, well known for their vile and hateful acts, make for such successful lead stars in their own self-titled films? Why does a sympathetic angle work so well, and does it actually do them, as iconic villains, any favors? And these are exactly what I'll be diving into for this video. I couldn't get my hands on a Cruella wig last minute, so you guys are gonna get a casual Harley today. Mark my words, her sympathetic origin story is only a matter of time. Many would pinpoint 2014's Maleficent as the catalyst for this evidently appealing cinematic trend. Although you could also argue that Star Wars was the first blockbuster franchise to kick this off, depicting the angsty, sand-aversive life of Anakin Skywalker before fatefully becoming the saga's greatest villain, Darth Vader. And yes, I know Broadway's Wicked is also famous for this very type of story, but I'm specifically going to focus on Hollywood movies for this one. In particular, the three most popular ones of this kind to come out in recent years: Maleficent, Joker, and Cruella. And Robert Stromberg's live-action adaptation / reimagining of Disney's Dragon Lady was arguably the first big cinematic smash hit in this backstory category to specifically focus on the villain herself, even titling the film under her name. It also went on to bank $758.5 million in the box office and launched Angelina Jolie as the gorgeous, iconic new face of this legendary Disney villain. 5 years later, Todd Phillips' Joker gained a ton of hype, Hollywood buzz, and a little bit of audience controversy as Joaquin Phoenix delivered an incredibly chilling performance as the Clown Prince of Crime. The movie went on to rake in over $1 billion at the box office, as well as landing itself an extensive list of nominations and awards, and an arguably unnecessary sequel in the making. I guess Phillips couldn't help himself. And with these two films raking in the dough, it's no surprise then that we had another one come out this year, by Disney no less, spotlighting everyone's favorite deranged puppy killer. However, while all three of these movies were centered on famously wicked fictional icons, they weren't really straight-up condemnations of said characters. Instead, the filmmakers opted for more sympathetic, compassionate portrayals, one that made you feel for these villains and even root for them. I'd argue, though, that this is one of the reasons why they did so well. They function pretty much in the same way as superhero movies or any other hero's journey type movie, having you actually take the side of these characters in a sense. And it sounds strange and and morally questionable. How do you turn these deranged, chaotically evil beings into heroes of their own story? And how do we fall for it? To craft a villain's origin story, the filmmakers would have to provide an explanation for how they became the big bad of their property. They'd have to offer insight into their motivations, beliefs, philosophy. What got them to the point where they'd want to skin innocent pets or destroy an entire city? Lazy as it is at this point, what better way to garner audience sympathy than to have these characters undergo trauma? In Maleficent, her iconic act of cursing the infant Princess Aurora is framed as an impulsive deed of revenge, a brutal retaliation on the man who betrayed her. You see, in the movie, she and the king were once upon a time in love, if you can believe it. Maleficent was once a powerful fairy living in the magical land of the Moors, and the king was a peasant boy named Stefan. But as all tragic love stories go, they eventually grow apart, and when the current dying king offers his throne and daughter's hand in marriage to whoever kills Maleficent, Stefan, lustful for power, turns on her. Son of a bitch visits her in the moors one night, drugs her, but unable to bring himself to kill his childhood sweetheart, instead severs Maleficent's wings in her sleep to present to the king. It is this devastating moment of betrayal that plunges our protagonist into apparent villainy, or at least the aesthetics of it, turning the moors into a dark kingdom and getting a raven sidekick. Eventually, we see her perform the classic evil scene we know her for, showing up to Aurora's christening uninvited and laying her curse upon her, one that could only be broken by true love's kiss. This curse being, in case you didn't know, that on her 16th birthday, she'll prick her finger on a spindle and die. So you see, she wasn't just some overdressed rando out to ruin a party. It was the greed, the treachery, the cold-heartedness of an evil king who started this mess. He mutilated her. Of course she'd want payback. In Joker, Arthur Fleck is painted as the victim of a corrupt society, one that fails to support the marginalized, the mentally ill, those struggling in a lower class. Throughout the movie, we see him ridiculed, condemned, and even physically assaulted by random delinquents. We then eventually learn that even his family history is fucked up, that he'd been lied to about his childhood and where he came from. He's also humiliated by the very people he admires or is meant to. People like Thomas Wayne, who he thought to be his dad, Murray Franklin, his comedic idol. All these scenes paint him as the helpless victim of a rotten environment, a damaged society. So when we get to the point where he becomes Joker, it's an almost satisfying moment. It's understandable how many would be rooting for him, the worst of DC's villains, to have the last laugh. And finally, while it does sound too good to be true, yes, Cruella's origins as a villain does kick off when her mom is, in fact, killed by Dalmatians, and it's as hilarious as you'd expect. Cue the sad and cliched orphan backstory. And this tactic, overused as it may be, works really well, because it humanizes these characters. There are no longer these dark, enigmatic forces of chaos. Suddenly there's reason behind why they behave the way they do. And these reasons are ones we can typically relate to. They went through some hard times, they were dealt a bad hand, they were mocked, ridiculed for being different. They were outsiders and people just didn't get them. And in the case of Cruella, they paint her to be this misunderstood genius. Someone who's unconventional and eccentric, just yet to have their brilliance discovered. It absolutely plays into our common love for an underdog. We love seeing characters persevere in times of struggle, to see them come out successful in whatever way that means to them on the other side. These stories of success or redemption against all odds tend to hit harder for most of us, much more than watching tales of characters who are already well loved and privileged and hold a perfectly virtuous image from the get-go. As stated by Asia Romano of Vox, a lot of us feel closer to the freaks than to the society that's keeping them at bay. Additionally, villains are also typically written as having an appealing rebelliousness or freedom about them, in contrast to their traditional heroic counterparts. While the latter often does what they're told, the former tends to stick it to the man, holding a confidence, conviction, and unrestrained approach to life that we find alluring. And this could explain why audiences were drawn to watching these origin stories in the first place, or really any film or TV series starring morally corrupt or villainous characters. They have a certain charisma about them, and they play into our deep-seated desires or temptations to defy the system and get away with things. There's that natural tendency in all of us to resist doing what we're told, so it's no wonder, really, that plenty of classic bad guys in fiction's past would eventually be reclaimed and reinterpreted by audiences. In fact, it was almost inevitable. On top of that, a fleshed out backstory also feeds the curiosity of many of how and why a character fell from grace, or how they got to be so captivatingly evil. However, others would also argue that digging into them in this way actually does these villains a little dirty, but I'll get more into that later on in the video. But back to how these films successfully attempt to reframe these characters in a more positive light for audiences, supplying them with even worse adversaries also helps to further bolster them as the hero of the story. Research has actually shown that an audience's judgment of on-screen characters is dependent on the moral comparisons they make between them, and order of introduction also counts. So take a villain like Cruella, Joker, and Maleficent, and eventually introduce antagonists even worse than they are. So in Maleficent's case, King Stefan, Joker, Society, and with Cruella, the Baroness, a fashion designer she comes to work for and who she eventually learns sick the Dalmatians on her mother. All three adversaries are worse than our leading characters, giving our villains a more likable coat of paint. Their enemies, ironically enough, serve as the new villains in these villain origin stories, functioning as sort of hate sinks to get us on Cruella's or Joker's or Maleficent's side. Also, simple as it is, even just the mere act of making these villains the leads in their own story allows us as the audience to spend a lot more time with them, which naturally has us develop a deeper investment in who they are and the choices they make. Like any traditionally heroic protagonist, we grow attached to them, helped with a more empathetic, thorough understanding of their motives, feelings, and actions. Because of this, despite the fact that we know they are or end up becoming bad guys, sometimes this amount of screen time spent with them can cause us to subconsciously overlook their faults and often corrupt choices. We end up still rooting for them, not necessarily to get away with their awful deeds, but to possibly redeem themselves, to mend their ways and turn over a new leaf before it's too late. It's almost like cinematic Stockholm Syndrome. A lot of the best TV shows in recent times achieve this very premise. And in particular, Breaking Bad and Succession, two fantastic shows with undeniably immoral protagonists, come to mind. But it's here where quality writing and a clear moral message is critical. A good villain origin story would want its audience to empathize with its flawed protagonist, but you'd also want to take care in avoiding actually glamorizing or glorifying any horrible deeds they do. I'll be diving more into this later on in the video, particularly with Todd Phillips' Joker. So now we've got a clearer look into why these movies have done so well with audiences, why they've successfully revamped these characters, figures we've grown up to fear or despise, into interesting or somewhat even cool, admirable icons. Given that their original counterparts were historically painted as evil or wicked, however, is this newfound sympathy a good thing? How did any of these movies even try and justify the eventual horrible deeds of their villains? I'm gonna dive into these questions and more, but first, a word from our sponsor. Let's talk about a real villain that most of us have to battle: self-doubt. That was super cheesy, but let's roll with it. If there's one thing we love about classic villains in fiction, it's that they always seem so sure, so confident, so fearless in their actions. They always seem so daring to take risks and live life according to their desires, though, of course, they're known for taking that to extremes. What if we could use that self-assurance for good? Well, thanks to the Skillshare class by author and activist Chidera Egera, I managed to get some good practical advice on being your best, boldest self while still being a positive force for others around you. As you're probably well aware, Skillshare is that sponsor that appears in every second YouTube video. And for good reason. The platform offers an awesome online learning community, hosting thousands of online classes for those with creative passions and interests. Though aside from your artistic categories of photography, creative writing, music, and filmmaking, Skillshare also offers classes under general lifestyle and daily productivity. And like I mentioned earlier, Chidera Egera's class, Revolutionary Self-Care, Embrace, Nurture, and Grow Your Authentic Self, stands out in this category, where she gives viewers active, inspirational advice on building a stronger sense of self-acceptance, respect, and validation, pushing us to stray out of our comfort zones and live up to our full potential. They're captivating, insightful lessons that can offer anyone a great boost of self-motivation. You can check out this class and the rest of Skillshare's extensive catalog through the link in my description, which offers the first 1,000 users with a free 1-month trial of their premium membership. What's also awesome about the platform is that it values an immersive learning experience, so there are no ads, and they're constantly launching new premium classes. So yeah, I highly recommend you guys go check them out. They've got an incredibly diverse lineup of classes and even more on life advice and self-care. Learn to embrace the alluring conviction and confidence of a Hollywood bad guy without actually being a bad guy, which is what these origin movies seem to be going for, as we'll soon see. Some would argue that shining a more sympathetic or compassionate light on the types of character tropes historically written to be dangerous, threatening, and antagonistic can provide audiences a deeper understanding of human behavior and sociocultural perspectives. Eliciting empathy for such characters can potentially make us more open-minded to different viewpoints, particularly those belonging to outsiders or the marginalized of society. And this was actually put to the test in a study featured in the 2012 paper of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, where researchers asked their subjects to read a bunch of stories starring various protagonists. Some of these stories revealed that their heroes happened to be members of minority groups. After reading, the subjects were then asked about their personal values and prejudices, and it turned out that those who read the stories featuring leading minority characters grew to have more positive views about the characters' group and were less likely to believe in the typical stereotypes surrounding them. When we look back on Hollywood's history of bad guys, they've had the tendency to villainize those with mental illnesses, physical disfigurements, and even those of a foreign culture. Writing them as leads in their own stories can thus lead to broader, more sensitive portrayals that can help diminish existing harmful social stigmas. Despite, however, the potential benefits of giving traditionally villainous tropes or stock characters an effective backstory to empathize or identify with, these specific villains I've mentioned already come from established IPs. And in those established IPs, they're not particularly written to be complex, marginalized, or misunderstood outsiders. They're just wholly awful people. Except the Joker, I guess. He did get himself a sympathetic backstory much early on with Alan Moore's The Killing Joke. But for Maleficent and Cruella in particular, how did they successfully get their audiences to keep rooting for these characters, a tragic backstory and all? Despite the fact that we know that per their classic tales, they still eventually perform some heinous-ass crimes. Original Maleficent literally went out of her way to make sure Aurora gets pricked by that spindle, despite the king destroying every fucking spindle in the kingdom. She then, of course, eventually turns into a dragon and tries to kill Aurora's true love, Prince Philip. So yeah, pretty irredeemable to say the least. And then you've got Cruella, who, as we know, grew into a deranged, chain-smoking old woman who wanted to skin puppies to make a fur coat. Yet Disney's now giving her this cool, flashy backstory and blatantly attempts to have us support and understand her. So how does all this work? Is Disney just doubling down on its moral bankruptcy? As funny as that would be to watch, not quite. Cruella and Maleficent are given the quick fix of character reinvention. Their villain origin stories, put simply, take place in an alternate universe. A more optimistic fanfiction of their original property, where they're not really a villain at all. In these movies, they are simply misunderstood, marginalized, and unfairly antagonized by society. But rather than turning to evil because of this, which, to be fair, is what the viewer would expect given that this is a villain's origin story, they're instead given a pretty little tale of redemption, where they essentially come out the good guy on the other side. Maleficent, as it turns out, doesn't actually want to kill the princess by the end of the movie. In fact, she grows a deep, maternal love for her. The love that, in fact, saves Aurora from Maleficent's curse, as ironic as that is. Cruella, on the other hand, turns out to not actually hate Dalmatians in this movie. Yeah, I know. In fact, she actually loves dogs. She has a dog. And she was responsible for giving Roger and Anita their famed Dalmatians, Pongo and Perdita, who are seemingly implied to be siblings in this movie, which is weird. Also, sorry for the sudden change in lighting. Night has befallen. Anyway, yeah, the closest we get to seeing a puppy killer out of this Cruella is a single joke she makes in wanting to turn the Baroness's Dalmatians into a coat. But that's all it was. A joke. PETA would be proud. But alright, let's accept that these are reimaginings of these classic villains. Fine. Do they, like I mentioned earlier, at least offer a profound deep dive into the complexities of social dynamics and the human psyche? I mean, unsurprisingly, no. Even with these more likable moral modifications, I'd argue that both of these movies are still pretty shallow in their explorations of human behavior and society. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they are, you know, sanitized Disney films. Maleficent, while brandishing a haunting allegory of sexual assault, along with feminist undertones and possible critiques of capitalism, according to some reviewers, sadly has its potentially powerful themes bogged down by an overly safe, overly Disneyfied, colorful, yet shallow approach. It's got some dark and profound messages in there somewhere, but sadly, for me at least, they got lost amidst the superficial and at times shoddy storytelling. And the fact that Elle Fanning, for her sublime acting talents, was given an incredibly underwritten, one-dimensional character is criminal. In Cruella, we get a leading character who struggles with two alter egos. You see, the titular character was actually forced to repress her true persona in favor of a tamer yet more acceptable personality named Estella. While both artistically bold and brilliant, Estella is far meeker, awkward, and fumbling, while Cruella is the madwoman fashionista who constantly seeks to steal the spotlight. And this concept could have been a great way for them to dive into her and to some extension our inner conflicting capacities for good and unhinged badness. But they portray the struggle and eventual transformation in the most superficial manner, spoon-feeding the audience through strikingly contrasting costume, hair, and makeup changes, and while admittedly making for great theatrics, it also made for jarring character development when she literally strode in the middle of the movie saying, "Yo guys, I'm Cruella from now on, that is now my name, this is now my look, deal with it." Of course, that's not to say that either movies didn't make for campy, fun entertainment, but that's all they were, you know, no real complex character studies here. So how about Joker? Well, you could argue that it did go much deeper into exploring its dark themes of mental illness and classism, and honestly, in my opinion, I actually thought they did make an intriguing, thought-provoking character study out of the DC villain, so props to them. However, the film, unlike Cruella and Maleficent, made the bold move of actually tying itself into the overall lore of the Batman canon, and having painted Joker with this new sympathetic coat of paint risks provoking the confusing reaction of, damn, I actually feel bad for the guy who's literally tortured and killed hundreds without a shred of empathy. To be clear, Warner Brothers stated that they never intended to hail Joker as a hero of any sort. But it's this great messaging that left plenty of viewers who related to the character's struggles as depicted in the film, actually feeling vindicated in his vengeful, though twisted actions and ideas. The film reportedly spurred incel extremist chatter online, sparking fear around a potential theater shooting. The US Army had to send out a memo to service members advising them to stay wary of their surroundings when entering theaters. Villain origin stories must thus be clear in its messaging. Either revamp the bad guy into a newfound anti-hero that the audience can guiltlessly root for, or bear down and have them be a villain. Sympathetic roots, even for irredeemable characters, can still work as long as the movie doesn't try too hard to justify or glorify the character's eventual evil actions. If they double down on the villainy while still portraying them as someone we can empathize with, if not necessarily like, then this type of origin story can still be pulled off, and also function as an interesting critique of the social structures that enable crime and bad behavior without particularly vindicating the bad guy. The take actually makes an excellent comparison of Joaquin Phoenix's Joker to Taxi Driver's Travis Bickle, the '76 Martin Scorsese film, heavily inspiring this portrayal of the DC villain. Whereas Joker almost dangerously validates the Joker's twisted actions by painting him as the abused, victimized underdog, Scorsese ensures that Bickle is painted as an inarguably unlikable, disturbed individual, while having us empathize with him as the movie's protagonist. Some people say that if you're going to make a sympathetic origin story for a bad guy, pick a villain who arguably has good intentions or a reasonable philosophy, just bad execution, or a tragic villain, one forced into a life of moral corruption due to circumstances beyond their control. When I think about it though, these types of villains in both shows and movies already tend to have their sympathetic motives or backstories explored, however briefly, in the existing material they're featured, making a 2-hour-long origin movie a bit redundant in that respect. But ultimately, and this is the final thing I wanted to unpack, however way these origins are crafted, does fleshing out a villain in this way, one we've come to love for their fearful, chaotic personas, have them lose that villainous mystique that made them so iconic in the first place? I'm gonna have to say yes, but depending on what you're drawn to with fictional characters, this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But I can't deny that what made these villains so alluring in the first place is the fact that they're such wild cards, unexplainable forces of chaos and evil, and strapping them with a cliched backstory of a tumultuous, orphaned, or rebellious childhood, paired with the whole misunderstood genius or outsider plot, effectively drops their enigmatic appeal. Basically, it robs them of their character, the persona that made them their character to begin with. They're also no longer scary, or at least significantly less so, a key ingredient investment in any memorable villain. And I don't think I need to explain how giving them a good guy arc just sort of adds insult to injury in this respect. Is this version of Cruella even Cruella De Vil anymore if she actually loves dogs and doesn't want to make a fur coat? Is Maleficent even the mistress of all evil when she's pretty much the hero by the end of her film? But okay, say you don't mind seeing a more human, relatable side to a once two-dimensionally evil villain. I mean, with quality writing and an inventive story, this could work. The approach of a sympathetic origin story for villains, after all, isn't automatically a failure. But, you know, sadly, Hollywood, and Disney in particular, tends to be risk-averse, opting for a formulaic, superficial approach when it comes to these origin stories. And so, I mean, I guess Joker comes the closest, but I've yet to see a movie that I guess truly does master or ultimately justifies a profound, thought-provoking, and nuanced sympathetic take on an iconic villain's origins. I mean, we've only had 3 major ones to come out, so I'm pretty keen to see what filmmakers have yet to come up with. To conclude, in my personal opinion, I think villain origin stories could be really interesting. I do like delving into the psychological evolution of how they got to be who they are. And I do believe it could help us question our existing societal assumptions and prejudices. It can also offer a good critique of society and its flawed structures. But with what we currently have under this category, I think there's a ton of room for improvement. If filmmakers are going to tackle issues as poignant as issues of class, race, gender, what have you, then they better have the writing chops to pull it off and a clear angle that audiences can get on board. Especially if they're dealing with already existing pre-loved villains who have historically been known to be figures of pure hate and evil. I can also understand, however, how some people may see established chaotic pure evils as better left alone. No use reinventing them or, God forbid, justifying their horrific actions. Sometimes leaving them to be two-dimensionally evil maintains that alluring mystique about them. It depends on what you're after, I guess, in terms of a story or a cinematic experience. Diplomatic answer, I know, but entertainment at the end of the day is subjective. To give credit where it's due, and just as a disclaimer in case I gave off the wrong impression, I really do like Joker 2019, and I actually really enjoy Cruella. And it's largely got to do with the mesmerizing performances of our leads. Joaquin Phoenix truly does give a harrowing, sad, and tragic portrayal of the character, even if the plot does have some predictable turns, and their depiction of the Joker can be seen as a bit too compassionate for a homicidal maniac. And Cruella, as I've said many times throughout this video, was actually quite fun. I love myself some good heists, wacky fashion, 70s rock, and I've always liked Craig Gillespie's directorial style. Maleficent, like I said, cute little Disney film, as inoffensive as you can get, and Jolie's performance was memorable, though at the end of it all, it was just a light family flick that I probably wouldn't watch again, to be honest. But that about does it for this video. I apologize for having gone through like 3 lighting changes. But I'd love to hear what you guys think about villain origin stories. Are they something you enjoy, or are they a genre of film that we can just do without? Oh, and what are your favorite movies or TV shows starring unlikable or even villainous protagonists? And this is just an excuse for me to segue once more into a fangirly promotion of HBO's Succession. It is amazing how they make you actually care for some of the most hateful characters on television right now. Also, it is just an amazing show. Please watch it. Anyway, of course, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy these kinds of pop culture commentary / video essays, consider subscribing and maybe even hitting that notification bell, because for some reason YouTube has not been pushing my new videos onto subscribers' feeds. I don't know why. But thanks for sticking around until the end of this video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.
You call me a saint, but you know I'm a stranger, all willing and